The secret buried in the basement. This is a true story, something that happened to me when I was a child, but to this day, I'm still haunted when I think about it. I lived in a suburban neighborhood back then, right next to a childhood friend named Ben and his little sister Maggie. We would always play together, especially in their front yard. Even then, I could tell something wasn't right. Ben and Maggie always looked skinny and malnourished, and their clothes were always old and tattered. Their house, too, was a sight that scared me. The lawn was overgrown, windows cracked, and the walls eaten away by termites. I always assumed it was because their mother had passed away years ago, and the house hadn't been cared for since. Speaking of their father, I was always terrified of seeing him. He was muscular, with horrible burn scars. It wasn't just his appearance. His voice was always angry, and he constantly yelled at them. One time, when we were playing in the front yard, he came home unexpectedly and scolded Ben for letting me onto their property. He grabbed me by the collar and threatened to give me a beating if he ever saw me near their house again. I panicked and cried the whole way home after that incident. After a while, I completely stopped seeing Maggie. She just disappeared. I feared that something terrible had happened to her. I overheard my parents talking about Ben's father. He was a veteran who had been dishonorably discharged after massacring a village full of innocent civilians. Another strange thing was that the body of his wife, Ben's mother, was never found. There were rumors that he had killed her too. Ben and I continued to play together, even though my parents warned me not to. One of his favorite games was hide and seek. Ben was a master at it. One day, while we were playing hide and seek in the yard, Ben suggested something crazy, playing hide and seek inside his house. I was hesitant, but honestly, a part of me had always been curious about what the inside of their house looked like. So, I agreed and went in. As I had expected, the place was a mess. Broken light bulbs, empty beer cans in every corner, and food stains on the walls. It looked more like a refuge camp than a house. Then I noticed something suspicious. The basement door was locked and chained shut. Ben told me I could hide anywhere, including the upstairs bedrooms, but I was never allowed to go into the basement, under any circumstances. I found the perfect hiding spot, an old, large wooden wardrobe. I slipped inside and shut the door. As I leaned back against the wall, it shifted. Losing my balance, I fell right through the cracked wall and tumbled into a dark place, what seemed like the basement. I stood up and tried to find my way out. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't stay calm. The stuffed animals mounted on the walls seemed to be staring at me. Then I heard crying coming from a chain door in the basement. I slowly moved closer and peeked through the crack in the door. I was shocked to see Maggie chained to a furnace. She had wounds all over her body and looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Before I could react, I heard the basement door open. Ben's father had returned and was coming down the stairs. I quickly hid behind a large shield. He spotted my footprints and immediately knew someone else was in the basement. He searched for me, coming within inches of my hiding spot before Ben came down the stairs, distracting him. He grabbed Ben by the collar and shouted angrily. I seized the opportunity to sneak out, but not before exchanging a quick look with Ben. As soon as I got home, I told my parents everything that had happened. Within hours, Ben's father was arrested. It turned out he had been punishing them by locking them in the basement without food or water for days. He was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and had taken his rage out on his children. Afterward, Ben and Maggie were sent to live with their aunt in North Carolina. I never saw or heard from them again. Uber drivers, weird night. I had been driving Uber for about a year. and had never really encountered any trouble, except for once when a drunk man tried to punch out my backseat window. But the only reason I quit this job has to do with something I had never encountered, and to this day, I still remember it vividly. Around midnight, I received a request to pick up someone named Pamela at an address that seemed a bit off the usual route. I drove to the address. The area was deserted, and there were no signs of anyone being around. Suddenly, the back door opened, and I jumped in surprise. Turning around, I saw an elderly woman, probably in her 80s. At this late hour, it was a bit odd, but I had seen older passengers before, though not very often. She silently struggled to get into the back seat, and I noticed her hollow, empty eyes, as if she had just woken up from a coma and couldn't make sense of what was happening around her. "How's your night, Pamela?" I asked cheerfully and friendly, but she didn't respond. A beep from my phone. A destination popped up. It was quite nearby, but I had never heard of it before, so I felt a little uneasy. I drove, trying to push that strange feeling out of my mind. The city blurred by in a haze, but then a voice, low and raspy, finally spoke. "Why aren't you taking me to that address?" she said to me. I told her I was taking her there, and it was still quite a distance. I replied, trying to stay polite. But the uneasy feeling, something wasn't right, kept growing. Then she started yelling at me, demanding I stop the car. It felt a bit rude, but what I needed to do now was stay polite. I wanted her out of my car, so I happily complied and stopped. I complied, stopping the car at a quiet corner just a few blocks away. I tilted my head to glance over my shoulder to wish her good luck, as it was part of my daily routine. But when I turned back, Pamela was right in front of my face, just millimeters away, hovering between the two front seats. I froze. Her eyes were white, sunken deep into her face. Her mouth was wide open, gasping for air, as if struggling and laboring to breathe. I stammered, "Pamela, are you okay?" Then her hand touched my shoulder. It was cold as ice, seeping into my skin and bones. Her pupils rolled back into her head, leaving her eyes completely white. My mind couldn't comprehend anything, and I began to fear for my own life. Before I could say anything, she leaned close to my ear and whispered in a chilling voice, "Go to the stairs tonight." I looked at her, confused. Pamela didn't say anything else, then climbed out of the car. I watched her shuffle toward a dilapidated building and disappear inside. I whispered to myself, not knowing what the hell had just happened. That night, I turned off the app and drove back to my apartment. When I arrived at the building, I sat in my car for about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to make sense of the woman's words. Eventually, I calmed down and went inside the apartment. I had just moved into this place because the rent was cheap, and it was an old building. People always complained about the maintenance and facilities. It really needed repairs, but the landlord never cared. I lived on the 6th floor. I went to the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers slowly go down. There was no one else in the lobby, but I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. The numbers on the screen flickered. Suddenly, I heard a hoarse whisper, cold and close to my ear, "Close it." I jumped, looking around, but there was no one there. "Pamela, is she following me?" Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I sprinted toward the stairs, almost crawling on all fours as I climbed. The darkness below seemed to be chasing me. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and sat on the floor. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something had collapsed to the ground, and the fire alarm went off, with people screaming. I opened the door and saw other tenants looking down the hallway, talking in panic. The elevator, it malfunctioned and crashed. The landlord was handcuffed and led away, charged with endangering tenants by neglecting maintenance. Other residents were shouting at him, angry at his irresponsibility. I stood still in disbelief that I was alive. As the police took the landlord away, I overheard two tenants talking, saying they remembered him once saying he had fixed it, but Mrs. Miller still died, crushed. They couldn't even imagine how terrified she must have felt when the elevator fell. "Who are you talking about?" I asked. One person answered, "That's Pamela Miller, the woman who lived in your apartment before you. She died in that very elevator, but somehow, the landlord got away with it. I still visit her grave sometimes. God bless her." My head spun as I tried to understand. I had just driven a woman named Pamela. I realized that the woman I had met wasn't just a strange passenger. I had encountered something beyond my understanding. Maybe she was trying to warn me so I wouldn't meet the same tragic fate as hers. The curse of the doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face, its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Claw looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Claw, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll, seemingly unaware of the curse. She was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. Rain pounded against the windshield as I drove down a deserted highway, my headlights barely piercing through the torrential downpour. I was a solitary traveler, accustomed to nights like this, navigating strange roads in search of new experiences. As I saw a sign emerge from the darkness, "Welcome to Cottage City," a wave of relief washed over me. Shelter was near. I pressed on, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. I drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town felt almost frozen in time. One house caught my eye, a crumbling structure by the roadside, abandoned and eerie. The walls were spray, painted with words like "Keep Out, Demon," and "Don't Look Back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone was trying to ward off something within. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over and stepped out into the rain, turning on my flashlight. I stood outside, the light catching the faded words, and when I shone the beam toward the house, I froze. In the upstairs window, a boy stood staring down at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his red, swollen eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't move, just gazed at me with an empty stare. I shivered and called out, "Hey, are you here alone, boy? Do you need help?" I mentioned that I was looking for a place to stay. The boy tilted his head, his expression unchanged, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me, questioning why I was there and suggesting I shouldn't be in this place. He began to speak. "Are you here to meet her?" It was an odd question, one that filled me with dread. I thought this place was abandoned. I asked why he was here alone and where she was. Then, inexplicably, he broke into a strange smile and told me, "Her? She's waiting for a replacement." His gaze shifted to something behind me, his expression turning to one of horror. A strong wind blew through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched me from behind. I turned around to see a creepy old man standing behind me with a lantern, his bewildered face wondering why I was standing in front of this abandoned house. I stammered, explaining that I was just a traveler, seeking shelter from the storm. I told him about the boy I had seen in the window, but he insisted that I must have imagined it, even though I knew what I had seen. I learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and he told me that if I wanted, I could stay overnight at his house. He made me feel strange, yet I accepted his invitation. It was hard to fathom that the boy I had seen in the abandoned house was just my imagination. But something told me this man knew more than he let on. The old man's house looked as ancient as its exterior. The furniture was old, the walls covered with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. He led me to a seat by the fireplace. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask him about the house. He told me that many years ago, he moved here with his father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so he quickly made friends with a boy named Roland. Roland's family was large and boisterous, always filled with laughter. Roland's aunt, a warm woman, always had candy for the children, especially for him. But one day, she passed away suddenly. The whole family was grief-stricken, everyone except Roland. He didn't shed a single tear, didn't say a word. He just stood at her funeral, frozen and silent, his eyes vacant even as they lowered her into the ground. He had changed since that day, hardly going outside and spending hours alone in his room. Ronald was always in his room with his Ouija board. He used to say his aunt had taught him to use it, and Ronald would sit for hours trying to communicate with her. As he continued his story, I could almost visualize the events unfolding. Something had shifted in him that day, something dark and frightening. Then he continued telling me about what the boy had gone through since that day. Right after his aunt passed away, frightening things started happening in that house. At midnight, Roland's mother began hearing strange noises coming from his room at night, scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping the walls. Roland lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. He felt a presence, something lurking beside his bed, watching him. Henry leaned forward. He told me how Roland had confided in his older friend, saying he felt eyes watching him every night as it stood at the edge of his bed, silent but terrifying. The next morning, Roland's mother checked his bed and found scratch marks on the mattress. And more than that, his mother found them on Roland's own skin. Roland would scream, sometimes laugh loudly in the middle of the night. His voice changed, becoming rough, distorted, and pained. Roland's mother would rush in, only to find him alone, trembling, his eyes filled with fear. He told her about them, strange, shadowy figures. They all gathered around his bed, staring with their hollow mouths open in a silent scream. They all thought Roland was different. Everyone knew something was invading him, but no one could stop it or help him. I shuddered as the old man recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Roland's family called in priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was among them, placing a cross under Roland's pillow, hoping to drive out whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, Latin whispers filling the room. The exorcism became chaotic. Roland writhed on the bed, growling like an animal as if the cross caused him unbearable pain. Furniture flew across the room, and the cross seemed to burn him, driving him into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from his mouth, mixed with a raspy laugh. His body twisted in unnatural ways, his eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Roland, and he endured immense pain. During the exorcisms, he would roll and vomit, spit, speak in Latin, then laugh uncontrollably. His voice was like a demon from the depths. Once, during an exorcism, Roland suddenly broke free from the priest's grip and lunged at the metal bed frame. He swung it wildly, striking a priest's arm, forcing them to halt the exorcism. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Roland's body as if someone invisible was carving them with a sharp knife. On the final night, 3 priests performed Roland's last exorcism, even witnessing his body levitating. When they recited the final incantation, Roland's body fell motionless onto the bed. Everyone believed he was cured. Roland's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw him again. Neighbors avoided the house, cursing it. Some families even moved away due to strange occurrences. He told me that some believe Roland's spirit never left, that he's still trapped in that house. I shuddered, recalling the boy in the window grinning at me, his eyes dark and hollow. I told the old man what I'd seen. Hesitating, as I said the boy looked no older than 14. The old man nodded slowly, saying that was Roland's exact age when he vanished. I was stunned by what I'd heard. The old man pointed to a small room under the stairs, suggesting I sleep there. He warned me again to stay away from the exorcised house, then went upstairs. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the boy from my mind. I wondered what would have happened if he hadn't come. Could I have been the next, just as the boy had said? The sun finally rose, and the memory of the night clung to me like a shadow. I thanked Henry and left, but the questions remained. Did Roland die during the exorcism, his soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed him? But one thing was certain, I would never return to Cottage City again. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, She grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. The deadly delivery. Have you ever felt like this might be the moment you die? If not, consider yourself lucky, because that's exactly what happened to me last week. I work at a local pizza shop. My job involves taking orders and delivering pizzas to customers during the night. I've always worked night shifts and never had any issues until last week. I was standing near the counter when the shop phone rang. The man on the line ordered 2 large pizzas and gave an address to a house on the outskirts of town. The man's rude behavior over the phone annoyed me, but I let it slide and started preparing for the delivery. I asked the cook to prepare the order. I checked the address on GPS and realized it would take me 20 minutes to drive there. I was driving through small towns. It was 10 p.m., so the streets were completely deserted. I spotted a house at the end of the street and realized it was the location. I parked near the house and stepped out. The house looked quite abandoned, as if no one lived there. I walked to the front door and knocked. I heard the door creak open after a few seconds. A rough-looking, angry man with a scruffy beard stood in the doorway. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. He asked, "What do you want?" I realized this was the same guy who had insulted me over the phone. I calmly said, "Here's your pizza," and handed him the boxes. The man eyed me up and down before paying me and slamming the door in my face. I walked back to my car and was about to start the engine when a sound caught my ear. It took me a moment to realize what it was. I strained to listen carefully and realized it was the sobbing of a little girl. I looked around but saw no one. Then I realized the crying was coming from the house I had just delivered the pizzas to. At first, I thought it might be his daughter. It could have been a private family matter, but there was something in the girl's cries, like she was begging me not to leave. I slowly got out of my car and tiptoed closer to the front door, trying to listen to the sounds coming from the house. The girl's sobbing continued, but this time I heard 2 more voices. I heard 2 men speaking in hushed tones, their voices raspy, though I could almost make out everything they said. The angry drunk man was yelling at another man, "I told you to shut the girl's mouth tightly." The other man replied, "I did, but she won't stop sobbing." They argued, their voices filled with profanity. The girl's sobbing grew louder. There was a small window on the porch. I slowly peeked inside, and what I saw terrified me. A little girl lay on a dusty mattress on the floor, her hands and feet bound, her mouth taped shut, her wide eyes filled with terror. The entire situation became clear to me. They were kidnappers, and this little girl was their captive. The house was likely abandoned, which is why they chose it as their hideout. I got back into my car, honestly terrified, and thought about just leaving. I figured it was better to let the police handle it, but I realized how dangerous it would be to leave the girl there. So, I called 911. The nearest station said they'd arrive in about 20 minutes. I stepped out and began moving toward the back of the house. When I reached the back door, I saw the two men heading upstairs, leaving the girl on the floor. I told myself this was my only chance. Luckily, the back door had a small pet flap. I reached through and turned the knob. Slowly, the door opened. The men were still arguing upstairs. I quietly made my way into the living room. I reached the girl. At first, she was terrified, but I reassured her, gesturing for silence and whispering that I was there to help her escape. I told her the police were on their way. She nodded tearfully. I started untying her, but suddenly I heard hurried footsteps. It was one of them. I immediately picked the girl up and began running toward the door. The bastard pulled out a large knife and chased us. As I neared the exit, he stabbed me in the leg. I screamed in pain, but I couldn't stop. The girl began crying and screaming in fear when she saw blood pouring from my leg. I held her tightly and ran as fast as I could. The streets were empty, and the next house was far away. I knew I couldn't make it that far. I prayed to God, begging for the police to arrive before they caught us. My hope of survival was slipping as I began to lose consciousness, but then I saw red and blue lights coming toward us. The sound of sirens made me breathe a sigh of relief. I passed out. I spent a week in the hospital. The police reunited the girl with her parents and arrested the kidnappers. The doctor told me I might have a limp for the rest of my life, but when the little girl visited me in the hospital, her smile and the happy tears on her parents' faces made every bit of pain worth it. I was happy to have saved a child's life that night, delivering pizza. The impersonator of the babysitter. Dylan was home alone, sitting on the couch in the living room, when his mom walked in with Joshua, a thin man who looked nervous. He was 12 years old and believed he was old enough to stay home alone, but his parents insisted on hiring a babysitter. Dylan immediately disliked Joshua, calling him a clumsy loser, a nerd in his head. Joshua tried to be friendly, but his anxiety was clear. His mom handed over the rules for the evening. Joshua had to make sure Dylan ate, didn't stay up too late, and didn't watch horror movies. But Dylan was determined to make everything difficult. He rolled his eyes and agreed reluctantly. Once they left, Dylan turned on a horror movie with gory scenes, deliberately trying to make Joshua uncomfortable. He enjoyed watching Joshua jump at every scare, his face growing paler with each moment. Dylan started suggesting Joshua order a pizza. He almost ran into the kitchen to get away from the TV screen, and Dylan couldn't stop laughing. While he was on the phone ordering, a new, wicked idea popped into Dylan's head. After a while, they got their pizza. But as Dylan observed, something was off in Joshua's behavior. He seemed too anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest noise. Dylan found this strange but shrugged it off, still focused on achieving his goal. Bored and wanting to scare the babysitter, Dylan suggested they play hide and seek in the dark. He thought Joshua would be desperate to escape the horror movie and agreed without hesitation. Things started to get strange. While in the bathroom, Dylan heard the doorbell ring, but he was a little surprised since the pizza was delivered so early. But when he stepped out, he saw Joshua staring at the front door with a scared expression, saying no one was there, and he thought it was the pizza delivery guy. The game started, and Joshua went to hide. Dylan found him after 5 minutes. Dylan asked,
"Why didn't you try hiding in the basement?"
Joshua said,
The dark scares me.
In Dylan's mind, the perfect plan continued to form. Joshua began pressing his face into the wall and counting, while Dylan hid, thoroughly enjoying his plan. The boy hid in the kitchen, secretly holding the TV remote, waiting for the perfect moment. As he started searching and approached the TV, the boy suddenly turned the volume all the way up, the sound of a terrifying scene, nearly giving him a heart attack. That was when the boy thought about hiding in his parents' closet to jump out and scare him. Dylan quietly tiptoed towards the bedroom, opened the closet, and that's when everything went still. Inside the closet was a dead body. It was a man with his head wrapped in a plastic bag, seemingly suffocated. Dylan, in a panic, tried to understand the situation, and suddenly I noticed a wallet sticking out of the man's pocket. The boy reached for it. He found an ID card that read Joshua Miller. If his babysitter, Joshua Miller, was dead in the closet, then the boy had no idea who he was playing hide and seek with. There was a killer in his house. He quickly ran under the bed, trying to steady his breath so the man wouldn't hear him breathing. A pair of feet entered and stopped right in front of the open closet.
Congratulations. It seems like you found your babysitter,
he said. Dylan realized that the game he had set up just minutes ago had now turned into a survival mission, as his life depended on it. The man pretending to be Joshua revealed himself to be Kyle. He had planned to trap Joshua for killing the boy, and now he intended to kill Dylan as well. His face suddenly dipped under the bed, and he screamed,
"It's your turn to be like Joshua."
Dylan, in a final desperate moment, ran out from under the bed. Kyle chased him, lunging at him with a knife. The blade ripped his shirt, but luckily it missed.
"I thought you liked horror movies."
He mocked the boy.
"This is your real-life horror movie, kid."
Dylan fearfully ran into a room and locked the door. Then he heard the doorbell. Through the window, he saw it was the pizza delivery person. Dylan shouted for help.
"Call 911 right now!"
But before the pizza guy could assess the situation, Joshua ran downstairs, opened the door, and charged at him with a knife. The pizza guy was stronger. After a struggle, he managed to pin Kyle down and snatched the knife from his hand. Kyle was convicted of murder. Dylan's parents rushed home after being contacted by the police. They were also grateful and gave the pizza guy a sum of money to thank him for saving the boy. Dylan's parents never left him alone with anyone again. Whenever they had to go out, he stayed with his grandmother. They would never hire a babysitter again. The horror Dylan experienced that night would stay with him forever. The ghost train on Christmas Day. It was Christmas Eve, and I was late for my flight. The snow was falling heavier than usual, and the slippery roads turned my usual route to the airport into a nightmare. I had to catch the last train out of town to make it to my flight. Otherwise, I'd be stuck until morning. I arrived at the station just in time to catch the train, which seemed unusually empty for such a busy night. It was an old model, not the kind of train I usually saw at this station. But I didn't have time to think about it. I hurried aboard. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed the conductor. He wasn't the usual friendly face I was accustomed to on my daily commutes. This man was older, gaunt, with tired eyes that made me uneasy. His uniform was dark and worn, as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside of the train was just as strange, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly musty lingering in the air. The train car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, but the atmosphere was tense, as if something wasn't quite right. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall heavier, blanketing everything outside. The train began to move, and I felt it sway slightly as it picked up speed out of the city. Then I heard the sound of a child crying, just a faint sob. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it echoed faintly again, as if coming from somewhere near the back of the train. I tried to ignore it, but it echoed in my mind. I began to feel increasingly uneasy, glancing around again, but no one else seemed to notice the sound, which only made it worse. Then I saw him, the conductor. I asked him if he heard it. He said, "Not all passengers on this train want to be here, but they cannot leave." To my bewilderment, he walked away immediately. I steadied myself and turned to ask him about what he had just said. But strangely, he was no longer there. I stood up and walked toward the back of the train. My footsteps echoed in the silence. When I reached the next car, I froze in place. In the dim light, I could see a shadow. It was a child. He clutched a small, tattered doll in his hands, wearing what looked like outdated, shabby clothes. He didn't move, his head bowed. I asked, "Are you lost?" But there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the train lurched forward, shaking violently. Without thinking, I reached out to steady the boy. The lights stabilized, but the train car was empty, completely deserted. I moved back into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The other passengers remained still, staring straight ahead, oblivious to the madness unfolding around them. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grasp my arm, sending a shiver through me. The train shook violently again, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The train screeched to a sudden halt, and I stumbled, trying to steady myself. The passengers were gone. The train was empty, except for the boy, standing with his back to me. He didn't move, just stood there with his head slightly tilted, as if waiting for me to do something. The doll in the boy's hand fell to the floor. I slowly approached him, bending instinctively to pick it up. When I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The boy turned, and his eyes were voids of pitch-black emptiness, locking onto mine. His voice echoed coldly in the air. "They left me." I panicked, never having seen anything like this before. Before I could react, the sound of crying turned into an ear-piercing scream, deafening and spine-chilling. I lost my balance and fell backward in fear, my vision spinning as the boy stood still, seemingly unaffected. The train doors suddenly slid open. With trembling hands, I crawled toward the exit, desperately trying to escape. I staggered out into the freezing, eerily silent night. But when I looked back, the train was gone, completely vanished, leaving only an empty, snow-covered platform as if it had never been there. I don't remember how I got home that night. Every Christmas Eve since, I still wonder whether the midnight train was real or just a nightmare. Years later, on another Christmas Eve, I found an old article, a newspaper archive about a train that disappeared in a snowstorm many years ago. The article spoke of a missing child whose parents had abandoned him on that very train. It was said that the Midnight Express appears every Christmas Eve, carrying lost souls who cannot move on. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. I looked out the window. The snow continued to fall outside, and a chill ran down my spine. The truck driver's scary encounter. The night was quiet, and I was out making overnight deliveries. Miles of open road stretched before me. I glanced at the clock. It was around 2:00 a.m. I decided to stop at a truck stop to refuel and use the restroom, knowing I wouldn't have another chance for quite a while. The truck stop was deserted, except for a few empty trailers parked nearby. I filled up my tank, breathed in the fresh night air, and then headed to the restroom. The stillness was unsettling, a strange quiet that made me feel restless. With a full tank, I climbed back into the truck, heading toward a stretch of road that would take me through dense woods. It was a long, desolate road, flanked by trees on either side, with no towns, no lights. just the road and the dark forest. An hour later, I was deep in the woods, half awake and half asleep, when something caught my attention ahead. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but as I got closer, I realized there was a figure standing at the roadside. The figure was motionless, just standing there, neither waving nor calling for help. They simply watched me pass by, their face a lifeless, emotionless mask. The figure faded into the darkness behind me as I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. About a mile later, I spotted another figure. This time, it was a woman. She stood at the roadside, wearing ripped jeans and a red sweatshirt. As I approached, our eyes met, and a wave of fear washed over me. She didn't move, didn't gesture. She simply stared, her gaze cold and unblinking. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of her as she turned her head to watch my truck go by. Her eyes locked onto mine through the glass. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to shake off the fear and keep going. I turned my attention back to the road, and my heart nearly stopped. Lying in the middle of the road was a body, sprawled out, arms and legs wide. I slammed on the brakes, the weight of the truck lurching forward as I came to a sudden stop. My mind raced as I stared at the figure lying in the road. I couldn't tell if they were dead or alive, but they were completely motionless. There were no signs of an accident, no debris, no skid marks, just this body, as if they had simply lain down in the middle of the road. I felt the need to go outside to check on them. The forest loomed on both sides, dense and dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I slowly maneuvered the truck around the body lying in the road, my heart pounding, my mind swirling with doubt. Maybe I should stop and check, just to make sure they were okay. I parked the truck a short distance away, and reluctantly, I stepped outside, but there was something about the way they were lying. I was almost there when a horrifying realization struck me. The body was no longer lying on the ground. It was standing upright, staring directly at me with empty, soulless eyes. That figure took a step forward, his movements jerky. Perhaps that was when I realized I had been lured into a trap. I turned to run back to the truck, but the figure lunged forward, moving quickly, intent on hunting me. I had no choice but to flee into the woods. Then I stumbled and fell hard to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle as I tried to get up, but that figure had come closer, a malicious look on their face. I grabbed a fairly large broken branch and held it out in front of me as he slowly approached with a sinister smile. I fought back with everything I had, but he was very strong, moved quickly, and was brutal. When he kicked me in the hip, I staggered backward. I thought everything was over, but a loud explosion echoed through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw a hunter standing nearby, his rifle aimed directly at my attacker. Under the dim moonlight, the hunter's tough and determined face pulled the trigger. The attacker staggered back, clutching his shoulder, dazed for a moment. The attacker staggered, trying to flee, but he was no match for the hunter. The hunter quickly seized him, easily subduing him. He started pulling out his phone and calling the police. I fell to the ground, relief and exhaustion washing over me at the same time. Soon, the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest. Officers approached, weapons drawn, securing the area as they took my statement. A few days later, I learned the police's conclusion. They called me into the station for a statement and some information. I found out that the man I had encountered, the one lying in the road, was not a stranger to the area. They identified him as a notorious criminal, wanted for a series of highway robberies targeting truck drivers. He and his accomplices planned and staged fake accidents to lure drivers out of their vehicles. They would lie in wait in the woods, ready to ambush anyone who fell into their trap. The strange encounters I had with the figures by the roadside were all part of their twisted game, a psychological tactic to unsettle and confuse victims before the final act. Thanks to the intervention of the hunter and the swift response of the police, they tracked down the criminals and apprehended him. With him now facing serious charges, I knew he wouldn't be lurking in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting people any longer. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The woman disappeared in white clothes. I grew up hearing stories from my cousin, who worked at the local police station. He was the kind of person who had seen it all. But there's one story he told me that always sent chills down my spine, and it's true. This story is about the mysterious woman in white. It all started with a midnight call from a gas station attendant. My cousin's colleague, Officer Nathan, was working the night shift. The attendant claimed he had been robbed, and the thief fled before he called. A woman in a white dress with long black hair, incredibly beautiful. Strangely, the suspect wasn't a masked figure or some shady guy, but a woman. He explained that she had come to him, asking for help because she was lost in the middle of the night. He had gone to the office to notify his boss, but when they returned to the cash register, she was gone, and so was all the money. Nathan, the only officer on duty so late, immediately got in his patrol car and headed to the gas station. It was a deserted road, winding through the woods on the outskirts of town. As Nathan drove, his headlights caught movement up ahead. A dark shadow was slowly walking toward him. Walking alone in the opposite direction was a woman in a white dress. She matched the attendant's description exactly. He accidentally passed her by, but unsure if his eyes were deceiving him, he saw that she had no face as he drove by. Finding it too unbelievable, he slowed down and reversed to check if she was indeed the woman the gas station attendant had described. After reversing, he stopped and quickly stepped out of the car, saying, "You need to get in the car and come with me to the police station immediately." She said nothing and complied. On the drive back to the station, he asked her a few questions about why she had stolen the money. However, she didn't say a word. He looked through the rearview mirror as she sat in the back seat, staring intently at one spot until they arrived at the station. Her behavior was strange, so he thought the woman might have mental issues. After that, he decided not to ask her any more questions. When they got back to the station, they began interrogating her, but she still didn't speak. His shift was almost over, so he prepared to hand over the report to the incoming officers. Just before he was about to leave, she suddenly started talking. She gestured and spoke, promising to return the money the next day if they let her spend the night in the holding cell at the station. She kept insisting that she had nowhere to go, and the officers were quite confused by what she was saying, unsure of what to do. Nathan reported to his superiors. He was informed that they couldn't move her to another holding facility that day. So in the end, they agreed to her request and placed her in the holding cell. Before leaving, Nathan made a final call to the gas station, informing the attendant that they had caught the suspect. The money would be returned the next morning, or so they thought. The next morning, Nathan returned to the station. As he approached the woman's cell, he witnessed a horrifying scene. The cell was empty. The woman they had arrested the night before was gone, except for the crumpled body of a man, her cellmate. His face was shredded with deep scratches, his wide eyes frozen in terror, and his body was pinned to the wall with nails driven into the flesh. Scattered around him were bills, and a few banknotes that hadn't been found the day before were stuffed into his pockets. Worse still, scrawled in blood on the wall beside his body were the words, "I have paid the debt." Nathan frantically searched the area. Even more terrifying was that she had completely vanished. No one heard or saw anything. The cameras? They hadn't captured any footage of her entering or leaving the cell. She had disappeared without a trace. A thorough search was conducted. The surrounding area was combed, and every possible lead was followed. But the woman in white was never found. She simply vanished, like a ghost fading into the darkness. Even to this day, no one knows who or what she was, but the officers present that night remain haunted by the incident. That's the whole story my cousin told me. I sat and listened, and I could still see the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. The question that always haunted me was how she managed to escape from the cell. Was she human, or something far worse? The strangest part is that she evaded all the surveillance cameras. After countless investigations, they still don't know what happened that night or where she went.
Scary story in the hospital. Nana. She is a nurse with experience working with elderly patients at a geriatric hospital. Today is her extra shift, so she is severely sleep deprived. She was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward love her very much. Tonight, Nana is attending to some patients, but one of them makes her more uneasy than the others. Her name is Len. Not only that, this is a poorly lit hospital room. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic, mixed with a faint musty odor that sometimes gives her goosebumps and makes her shiver. This is her first night working with Mrs. Len. Len is a middle-aged woman with messy hair and wide, fearful eyes. Every time she enters the room, Len starts talking about the voices she hears and the man in black in the corner of the room. Another woman in the room had requested the curtain to be drawn before her shift started so Len wouldn't be disturbed. The shift starts around 9 p.m., and most patients are asleep by 11 p.m., but not Len. Whenever she calls her in, she speaks with a trembling voice about the voices she hears. The man in black keeps staring from the corner of the room, which frightens her a bit. She has to reassure herself that it's just the medication. She believes that in Len's mind, she is seeing and hearing these things and feels very empathetic. Just imagining those things is very scary. She tries her best to help Len calm down and sleep. Len calmed down and fell asleep after a while. When most of the patients have fallen asleep, time seems to pass very slowly. The corner of the room appears darker, the shadows thicker, and now it has become suffocatingly silent. 1 or 2 hours later, While Nana was in the equipment room to get some supplies, I heard something in the room. The room was quite small and relatively quiet. Strangely, she had closed the door. She immediately turned around but saw nothing and continued to focus on getting the supplies. She tried to focus, but Len's silent warnings echoed in her mind, creating a sense of unease. A moment later, she suddenly felt a cold chill down her neck, as if a hand touched both of her shoulders. Nana looked down at her shoulders and then screamed loudly, but there was nothing there. She looked around and checked the door. There was no one in the room, but she felt a large presence gripping her shoulders. With no other choice, she had to complete her work. She continued loading items onto the cart until it was full. When the supplies were full, the single light bulb above her flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Nana glanced at a moving shadow reflected on the wall in front of her. She turned around and saw a faint human silhouette reflected in the glass window of the storage room door. The figure was not clear, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood completely still, watching her. Her breath caught, and her hands began to tremble. As she slowly approached, she started screaming loudly and collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding as she saw the man in black standing there, smiling eerily through the glass. The scream was loud enough to wake everyone up. The man disappeared from view through the glass door, and a few seconds later, the door opened, and one of her colleagues helped her up. She immediately asked about the man, but there was no one else there besides the two of them. The scream had awakened Mrs. Len, and when she walked in, Mrs. Len was holding her head, repeatedly talking about the voices, the laughter, and the screaming. Nana asked her what the man in black looked like, if he was smiling strangely. But Mrs. Len just focused, frowned, and looked at the corner of the room, terrified. She then said,
"How do you know?"
And Nana began to feel scared, her heart racing, thinking it might be true. Mrs. Len started screaming to be taken out of there and urged to be removed quickly before he arrived. The other nurses came in and tried to help her calm down. That night, due to unstable mental health and overwhelming fear, every creak and groan of the old building startled her. Her nerves were tense and painful, but she vowed to protect her patients from any darkness lurking in the shadows. Determined to find the source of this evil presence, Nana, with a sense of medical duty, returned once more, summoning all her courage as she descended the creaking basement stairs, the air growing colder with each step. She found herself in a forgotten basement room, filled with dusty old medical equipment and shelves lined with ancient books. In the center stood an old mirror covered in a thick layer of grime. Nana approached the mirror, feeling a powerful, oppressive energy emanating from it. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the reflection, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Realizing the figure was bound to the mirror, Nana frantically searched the room and found a ritual doll on one of the shelves. An inscription indicated it could be used to banish the spirit. Gathering all her courage, Nana placed the doll down and recited a prayer she had learned as a child, hoping to expel the evil presence. The shadows wavered, and the figure seemed to weaken. But it wasn't enough. The figure screamed in rage as she pressed the cross and the doll against the mirror. The glass shattered with a piercing sound, and the figure disintegrated. The room began to warm, the oppressive feeling dissipating. Everything gradually felt lighter. Everything was strangely quiet and peaceful. A few days later, Len improved and was discharged from the hospital. Nana continued her work with a new purpose. always vigilant for potential encounters with the otherworldly. This was also a testament to the power of courage and the triumph of light over darkness.
Headless bus passenger. Late at night, the university campus was eerily quiet and shrouded in darkness. Calla hurried toward the campus bus stop after a long evening of studying. The long, empty street was lit by only a few dim streetlights. There was only one bus left at the stop, its headlights cutting through the cold, misty air. She boarded the bus, her eyes briefly glancing at the driver, a man well into his years, his face lined with deep wrinkles and dark, unreadable eyes. Calla sat in the middle of the bus, trying to relax, but she suddenly sensed something strange. Through the rearview mirror, she realized the driver was staring at her intently. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something on her face. After a few minutes, she began to feel something was wrong. The route they were taking was unfamiliar. Instead of heading toward her dormitory, they were drifting into a desolate area where thick darkness swallowed everything. She leaned over, peering out the window, looking around in growing confusion. Calla turned to remind the driver about her destination, but he didn't respond. His eyes were no longer on the mirror but fixed straight ahead. He pressed on the gas, speeding up, ignoring the narrow, winding roads. Calla's fear surged. She raised her voice.
This isn't the way to my dorm.
But the driver didn't hear or didn't care. His face had gone pale, as though he was terrified of something unseen. Suddenly, the bus swayed, and vague shapes began to materialize outside the windows. At first, they were shadows of people standing by the roadside. Then they became clearer faces with empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silent agony. They stood there, watching like bloodthirsty specters. Calla curled up, trembling, too afraid to look at those ghostly figures for long. She felt like screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally slowed down. The familiar sight of the dormitory building appeared ahead, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Without wasting time, she grabbed her backpack and hurried off the bus. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the driver's voice for the first time that night. His voice was low, trembling, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. The driver's words were brief, but they hit Calla hard.
Wait!
His voice was tense. The driver told her that when he looked in the mirror earlier, he didn't see her head, only a headless body sitting where she was. He had been driving in circles, trying to shake off the spirit he believed had latched onto her. He couldn't hear her when she spoke because, in his eyes, she had already disappeared. He then warned Calla,
When you get to your room, take off your clothes and burn them immediately.
Calla stood still, the weight of the driver's words pressing down on her. Staggering, Calla made her way into the dorm building, her mind still spinning. She fumbled with her key at the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, Calla rushed to her roommate's bed, shaking her awake. Her roommate listened, wide-eyed, as Calla explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Calla frantically began taking off her clothes, her movements hurried and desperate. She gathered them into a pile, staring at them as her mind replayed the driver's warning. With trembling hands, Calla picked up the clothes and went to the bathroom. She struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of fabric. The flames quickly consumed the clothes. But had it really ended? She returned to her room, exhausted, lying down on her bed, but unable to shake off the lingering terror. The room was silent. Only the sound of her and her roommate's breathing filled the space. The next morning, sunlight poured in, as if to dispel the previous night's fear, but unease still clung to her. She stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly. Her head, her eyes, and her entire body, but her gaze was far from peaceful. She couldn't erase from her mind the image the driver described the moment when he didn't see her head in the mirror. The darkness from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, as if waiting for a moment of weakness to return. She knew her life would never be the same. The haunting memory of being headless and the spirit the driver had tried to divert would forever follow her. reminding her that terrifying things exist right next to us in the most unexpected moments. Stranger on the way home. I was driving home on a quiet, deserted road, my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. A familiar road I had traveled countless times. I was still about 10 minutes away from home when my car began to slow down. Confused, I pressed the gas pedal, but the car continued to lose speed. Panic set in as I realized the problem I had run out of gas. I suddenly remembered the low fuel warning light had come on, but I had forgotten about it, and in my rush, I had completely missed stopping to refuel. My car stalled, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out of the car, the chilly night air biting at my skin. Glancing at my phone, I saw the worst: no signal. I wasn't surprised. This road had no reception. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. It was nearly midnight, and there was no point in calling anyone. My friends were likely already asleep. I knew the area well enough to remember a gas station about a mile away. It would take 20 minutes to walk, maybe less, and the weather was fairly mild. So I decided I would make the quick trip. I grabbed an empty gas can I kept in the back of my car for my lawnmower. At least luck was on my side in some small way. There were no streetlights, only dense forests on either side. The road was eerily quiet. Only one or two cars passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty road before vanishing into the night. As I walked, my footsteps crunched on the gravel by the roadside. Every sound seemed amplified by the stillness. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept walking. Then, I heard it. It was the sound of a car engine behind me. I stopped and turned around. A pickup truck was slowly approaching the spot where my car had broken down. My first thought was that they might stop to help, and for a brief moment, I considered asking for a ride. But then I saw them, two men. They got out of the truck, their faces quickly obscured by black masks pulled over their heads. One of them shined a phone flashlight into the window, while the other knocked on the door. They tried to open it, but of course, the doors were locked. I crouched down and moved closer to the edge of the forest, hiding in the shadows. Maybe they hadn't seen me yet, but they were rummaging through my car. Panic rose in me when one of them turned and looked in my direction. Suddenly, he started walking toward me. I froze. The other man got back in the truck, and I heard the engine roar as it sped forward, heading straight for me. I didn't have time to think. I sprinted into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the undergrowth, chasing me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch me. In what felt like an eternity, I ran through the edge of the forest, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. After a few minutes, I saw a large, isolated house ahead of me. I ran behind the house, pressing myself against the rough, cold brick wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear any sound of pursuit. I crouched there for a few minutes. Finally, I dared to move, cautiously slipping through the backyard toward the old path. I didn't want to knock on the door because it was too late, and I didn't want to cause them any alarm. I walked on high alert, every sound making me shiver. I looked around the area. No truck, no sign of the men. I continued walking toward the gas station. Another car came, and without thinking, I rushed back into the forest, hiding until the sound of the engine faded away. Finally, the gas station appeared in front of me. I felt relief as I filled up the gas canister. When I finally made it back to my car, I shakily poured the gas into the tank. I drove straight home, too scared to look back. As I sat in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the thought of those men, and I realized how lucky I was to have made it home safely. The last ride. I had been driving for Uber for about 6 months, mostly at night. The pay wasn't great, but the quiet streets and dark city made it tolerable. People always had their own stories to tell, and most rides were uneventful. Drunk passengers, late-night partygoers, or quiet workers returning home. But one night changed everything. It was a Friday, a little past 1:00 a.m. I was sitting in my car, parked near the downtown area, waiting for my next fare. The streets were mostly empty, a light mist hanging in the air. My phone pinged with a new ride request. The pickup was in an isolated area on the outskirts of town, where the streetlights were few and far between. I hesitated for a moment, but accepted the ride. As I drove through the quiet streets, the mist thickened into a fog, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. The GPS directed me down a narrow, winding road, surrounded by trees on both sides. I glanced at my phone. Destination, a spot marked only as unknown road. The location seemed remote, almost too remote, but I shrugged it off. People lived in weird places all the time. When I pulled up to the pickup location, there was no house, just a dirt path leading into the woods. I waited, glancing nervously at the trees, their branches looming overhead like skeletal fingers. My phone chimed again, a message from the rider. "I'll be right out." I watched the darkness, waiting for someone to emerge, but minutes passed and no one appeared. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the fog, walking slowly toward the car. My headlights illuminated a tall man, wearing a long, dark coat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but something about him felt off. He opened the back door and slid into the seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. The man didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he said in a low, raspy voice,
"Just drive."
Every instinct in my body screamed at me to cancel the ride and get out of there, but I didn't want to make a scene. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, glancing at him in the rear-view mirror. He was staring out the window, his face still obscured by the shadows of the back seat. As I drove, the fog thickened, making it hard to see the road ahead. The man remained silent, his presence heavy and unsettling. Every now and then I'd glance in the mirror, and he'd just be sitting there, motionless. The tension in the car was suffocating. After a few minutes, I broke the silence. "So, where exactly are we going?" The man slowly turned his head to face me. His eyes met mine in the mirror, and I felt a chill run down my spine.
"We're going home,"
he whispered. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's home?" He leaned forward, his face now partially visible in the dim light of the dashboard. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, empty.
"Yours,"
he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A wave of terror washed over me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart raced as I turned to confront him, but the back seat was empty. The door was still locked, and the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. I sat there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I checked the mirror again. Nothing. I turned in my seat, but the back seat was completely empty. The man was gone. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and checked the ride. The request had vanished, as if it had never existed. There was no record of the trip, no rider profile, nothing. I sped away from the spot, the fog swallowing the road behind me. When I got home, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling as I did so. I don't know what I encountered, but the image of the man's sunken eyes and his cold words echoed in my mind and seemed impossible to forget. I never drove for Uber again after that night, and every time I pass by that isolated road, I feel a cold dread settle in my chest. Somewhere out there, the man in the dark coat is still waiting for his next ride. Escape from the terrifying truck. On a Sunday afternoon, Mac and I decided to go hiking in some hills, just an hour's drive from the city. The hill we chose today had a fairly simple trail, not too steep, and when we reached the top, everything felt peaceful, just like any other time we had gone hiking. After a short rest, we started heading down, but just 10 minutes later, Mac began complaining about the rough path. He wanted to take a different trail down. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We hadn't seen another soul since we started our descent. Then we heard the sound of an engine. A rusty, heavy red truck was coming toward us. The man driving rolled down his window and flashed a smile that seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. He offered us a ride. Mac, always trusting, thought the guy seemed nice enough. I wasn't so sure. Mac begged and convinced me to get in, saying it was only a 10-minute drive. I was cautious, but I got in with him. Inside, the truck was shabby but clean. As we settled in, I instinctively started scanning my surroundings. My eyes were drawn to the floor, where I saw a coil of rope behind the driver's seat. Unease began to creep in. 10 minutes passed. We were no closer to the main road, and the woods around us grew denser. I asked the man how much longer it would take. He said we were just taking a different route and that we'd have to stop somewhere to pick up his stuff. We stopped in front of a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. There was an old tree stump out front, with a large axe stuck in it as if he had been chopping wood. I glanced at Mac, but he seemed excited and trusting of the man. The man turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He said,
Stay here. I'll be right back.
As soon as he was out of sight, panic started to rise within me. I turned to Mac, pleading with him to leave, not to get out, but he didn't see the danger I saw. That's when I turned back to the truck and saw it. Half hidden under the driver's seat was an axe. Dark stains covered the blade stains that could only be blood. I quickly told Mac to look. He froze, his face turning pale as he realized the danger we were in. Without another word, we bolted into the forest, fleeing the imminent threat. We crashed through the thick underbrush, not caring where we were headed as long as it was away from that cabin, trying to stay on a trail to avoid getting lost. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the wooden fence surrounding the parking lot. A wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw it. The man's truck was parked on the other side of the lot, engine off, lying in wait like a predator ready to pounce. Mac wanted to run to our car, but I held him back. The parking lot was too wide, too exposed for us to make a safe escape. We hid behind a large tree, cloaked in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As night fell, I heard a sound. The truck's door creaked open. The man climbed out, glancing around the forest once more. Mac made a mistake. He stepped on a branch, causing a snap. The man noticed and lingered for a moment, then started walking toward a nearby tree. We covered our mouths, hearts pounding, afraid to breathe or move as he came dangerously close to where we were hiding. Just then, a forest ranger approached the truck. The man seemed startled or afraid of being caught, so he quickly returned to his truck and drove away. As soon as he was gone, we bolted to our car, not stopping until we were inside with the doors locked. We sped out of there as fast as we could. That night, we drove in silence. The danger was behind us, but the fear lingered. As we finally returned to safety, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if we had stayed in that truck any longer. When we got back, we reported the incident to the forest rangers so they could investigate and warn other hikers to be more cautious. Mysterious man at the fast food restaurant. I had been working at this 24-hour fast food restaurant for years. Most of my night shifts were quiet. However, tonight was different. The night started like any normal shift. Nothing out of the ordinary. Our night cook called in sick, leaving me to manage the whole restaurant alone until someone could assist at 4 a.m. The silence in the restaurant was eerie. With no customers around, I spent time cleaning the kitchen, focusing on scrubbing away the grime. Then, I heard a loud noise coming from the front of the restaurant. There was a man outside the entrance. He was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, peering inside and banging on the door. He didn't seem normal, which made me feel uneasy. The door was locked. I approached the glass, trying to stay calm, and gestured for him to go around to the drive-thru. He didn't respond, just stared. I shouted through the glass that the dining area was closed, but he didn't move, just stood there, lifeless. I turned and went back to the kitchen. I tried to continue working, focusing on my tasks. 15 minutes passed, and I convinced myself that he must have left. But the unease still lingered. A beep went off in my headset. Someone had placed an order. I turned on the mic and asked for their order, but all I got was silence. I checked the camera at the drive-thru lane, no car, no sign of anyone. I sighed and turned away, but then I froze. I heard something footsteps, light, careful steps coming from above, as if someone was walking on the roof. I tracked the noise until it stopped at the ladder leading to the maintenance door in the ceiling. The footsteps halted above. I was sure someone was up there. I quickly searched for a lock or anything to secure the door. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure if it could even lock. I heard the trapdoor creak. It was slowly beginning to open. A small gap appeared, and through it, I saw a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring at me. Panic consumed me, and without thinking, I turned and ran toward the front door. I bolted outside to my car, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Trembling, I called the police and described what was happening. From the safety of my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my eyes scanning the windows, and then I saw him. A shadow moving near the counter. For a moment, he looked directly at me, then suddenly darted into the kitchen. The police arrived and searched the entire building, inside and out, even checking the roof. But the man had vanished, disappeared as if he had never been there. Nothing was stolen. No money, no equipment, nothing was missing. He had broken in, but he didn't take anything from the restaurant, like a strange stalker. After the police left, I sat in my car, staring at the darkened restaurant. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw him look at me in such a strange and unsettling way. I went back to work. My boss had installed a lock on the ceiling door, a safety measure that should have been done long ago. But my job was never the same. From then on, I startled at every sound, never knowing if he would come back. Screaming in the crematorium. I work at the morgue in the crematorium area. It's not exactly the most glamorous job, but it helps me pay the bills, and that's what's important to me. Plus, I don't exactly hate working there. I've never been the most sociable person, so at least I don't have to deal with many people. Technically, my job isn't much different from filing paperwork in an office job. The tasks involve checking tags on bodies to ensure everything is in its rightful place, placing a body in, cleaning one of the machines for another body, and collecting the ashes. I have to admit, though, that sometimes this job can be a bit more gruesome than office work, especially when dealing with a severely decomposed body or a dismembered cadaver from a medical case. But I've gotten used to things like the smell of burning flesh, human ashes on my clothes, and so on. It was one of those days when I was working alone. We had 5 bodies to cremate and 3 machines. I had placed 2 of the bodies in the machines, I was waiting for them to finish. It would take about 2 hours to cremate one body. Bodies can make sounds when they're burning. Sometimes it's moans or hissing noises. These are just the sounds of gases escaping from the body, a pretty unsettling part of the decomposition process that no one really talks about. But I've mostly learned to tune those sounds out. I had just checked the ID on the body I had placed into the machine, a tiny old woman who had arrived the day before. Her name was Hylis. She had died from a fall and had a horridly long gash on her head. She was definitely dead when I placed her on the conveyor belt. My attention was on the body I had just put in, and as I listened, I could hear it, the faint, indistinct sound of a weak scream. I had never heard a dead body scream before. I thought it was just the air escaping or something like that, so I shrugged it off and went back to preparing the next body. But then I heard a knocking from inside one of the machines. I froze for a moment, and my heart began to race. I turned back to Hylis's machine. She had been burning for nearly an hour. Her body should have been nothing more than charred bones. Yet, I could see movement, hear the banging. The screaming started again, this time louder. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But the banging grew more intense, and the scream turned into a desperate, raspy voice, choking out the words, I stepped back, starting to feel uneasy as something banged against the door again, causing it to warp. But I could swear that the body had moved. Then, the door of the machine buckled. Flames burst out from the sides, and smoke filled the room. The door flew open, and I saw a shadow move through the flames. I held my breath as I realized this was no joke. I stumbled backward, seeing charred, skeletal hands emerge from the door of the machine. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, sprinting toward the door, not stopping until I was out on the street. The smoke alarms were blaring as I reached the door, and the sprinkler system had activated. Sirens wailed in the distance as firefighters arrived on the scene, and they managed to extinguish the flames. The crematorium was reduced to a charred skeleton. The next day, the news reported a mysterious fire at the crematorium, destroying most of the building. The cause remains unknown, and her remains are believed to have been lost in the fire. Stalked by the clown at the chicken shop. I was working full-time at a chicken shop. Not exactly the job I wanted, but it was enough to get by. Most evenings, I survived on leftover chicken, and then, that Saturday night happened. It had been a long and exhausting day. The restaurant was packed from morning until late at night. As I was cleaning up, my feet aching, I noticed him sitting alone at a table in the corner, waving frantically. At first, I thought he wanted to order, so I walked over, trying to smile. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't a normal customer. He was a mime, grinning widely, dressed in the classic black and white striped outfit, his face painted ghostly white. He didn't say a word. He just performed. I guessed he wanted chicken and fries, so I handed him the food without thinking much about it. I was too tired to care. His expression twisted with irritation the moment I gave him the tray. His grin morphed into a frown. He suddenly stood up and threw a few fake punches into the air like a boxer. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I told him to leave, but his face darkened even more. Slowly, he raised his hand, mimicking the act of pulling something invisible from his back. He stared at me without blinking, slashing the air with the invisible object. I played along, pretending to throw an imaginary stone at him. He staggered back, clutching his head as if I had struck him, then dashed out the door. I laughed at the absurdity of it. I thought it was harmless, but I was wrong. That night, my colleague and I were walking home together. I told him about the mime, and we laughed as we walked. But as we approached the building, I saw something, or rather, someone standing in the shadows of the hallway. A figure, dressed like the mime. I froze, staring, but chalked it up to my tired imagination. A few days later, after another late shift, I stepped outside. I walked home alone, the cold wind biting into my skin. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, not even bothering to change out of my uniform. As soon as my head hit the pillow, the doorbell yanked me out of my restless sleep. Groggily, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the colleague I usually walked home with. He wore his usual green beanie, but stood with his back to the door. I mumbled as I unlocked the door. "Did you forget something again?" But when I opened it, it wasn't him. It was the mime, his face painted ghostly white, grinning at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. He bowed and slipped past me without a word, heading straight for the bag of leftover chicken on my table. I stood there, frozen, as the mime rummaged through the bag. He pulled out a chicken leg, took huge bites, chewing slowly, savoring it like some twisted parody of a meal. Then his eyes lit up. He turned to me, mimicking the act of dipping fries in ketchup, grinning like a madman. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed over, snatched the food from his hand, and yelled at him to leave. His expression darkened. He slowly reached behind his back, pulling out the invisible knife he had shown me earlier. Only this time, it wasn't imaginary. Luckily, I reacted just in time, and it only grazed my arm, leaving a small cut. I bolted out of the room, blood dripping down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster, closer. In my panic, I fumbled with the buttons, desperately pressing the close button as he charged toward me. At the last second, the elevator doors closed. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my vision blurred from pain and fear. The elevator doors finally opened in the lobby, and I staggered out, barely able to stand. My voice trembled as I called for help, and a passerby rushed over, eyes wide with fear. Someone had called 911. When the police arrived, after an hour of investigation, they told me they had searched the building but found no one matching my description, and the security footage had disappeared. He held up an evidence bag. Inside was the knife, but there were no fingerprints. They couldn't find him, but the weapon was proof that it had happened. After that, I moved away and quit my job. I couldn't step foot in that store again. But even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands shaking, and every time I see him in the corner of the room, grinning, holding that bag of chicken. The threat of the gas station customer. Evie had been working the night shift at the gas station for many years. It was always quiet, slow, and uneventful. Her shifts usually started at 8 p.m. every day. The first few hours passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers coming in for gas or snacks. But after 11 p.m., the traffic slowed, and by midnight, the station became eerily quiet. She tried to keep herself busy, organizing merchandise on the shelves and cleaning, but there wasn't much to do. The silence and the ticking of the clock made the second half of her shift feel endless. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into one of the parking spots near the entrance. At first, she didn't think much of it. Most cars came in for gas and left immediately. But this car just sat there. No one got out. She stood up straight behind the counter, waiting for anyone inside to come in. She leaned over the counter, looking through the glass door, but nothing happened. Maybe they were just resting? She shrugged and continued scrolling on her phone, distracted for about 20 minutes. When she looked up from her phone, there, standing in one of the aisles, was a man. He was just there, staring at her. She hadn't heard the doorbell, hadn't seen him walk in. How had he gotten inside without her noticing? The man quickly averted his gaze when he saw her looking. He appeared to be in his 40s floor, wearing a dark coat and a scruffy beanie. There was something about him that made her uneasy. He moved slowly through the aisles, his eyes occasionally glancing toward her, as if assessing whether she was watching him. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. She tried to remain calm, watching him closely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something bad. Suddenly, he turned toward the front door and hurried outside. She dashed out the door, her heart racing. The car was still parked there, but the man walked right past it, disappearing into the darkness along the road. She went straight to the security camera to figure out how he had gotten in without her noticing. She pulled up the footage, scanning through until she found the moment he arrived. The footage showed him stepping out of the parked car, but instead of going inside immediately, he stealthily made his way around to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras there, but she knew those doors were never locked because they were broken. What chilled her the most was the timing. 15 minutes passed between the moment he went behind the building and when he appeared in the store. 15 minutes he spent lurking out of sight, waiting for something. Weeks had passed since that night, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shift felt like a test for her. One night, while she was cleaning the counters, she noticed something strange. The man entered the store, his eyes scanning as if searching for something. She watched him from the corner of her eye, and that was when she saw it. Something that seemed horrific. Then he approached her checkout, and she thought she might have guessed right. Dark stains on his sleeve, splotches that looked like blood clinging to the fabric, and he had done something vile and horrible. She wasn't sure if it was the same man, but she sensed it was him by his stature and clothing. She froze, her hands clenched, as he slowly moved down the aisle, seemingly oblivious to her stare. He quickly slipped away, melting into the shadows, and she was left in silence. She resolved to take action. The next time he appeared, she would be ready. A few nights later, he returned. She heard the faint sound of the doorbell and looked up to see him standing right inside, his face hidden in the shadows. She quietly picked up the phone, dialed the police, and kept her voice just above a whisper. She reported the suspicious man, describing his erratic behavior and the blood she had seen on his sleeve. But then, he noticed her. His eyes narrowed, and he realized what she was doing. Without warning, he charged toward her, knocking the phone from her hand. She stumbled back, grabbing anything she could use to defend herself as he backed her into a corner, his face contorted into a disturbing grin. She collided with the shelves, knocking items to the floor. She tried to grab a can from a nearby rack and threw it at him, buying herself a split second to dodge him and run toward the door. But he was quick, grabbing her arm and pulling her back, forcing her against the back of the store. I encouraged myself to survive and reassured myself that the police would arrive soon. He tightened his grip and pressed his face close to hers with a terrifying gaze. She felt panic rising, but she saw the police through the glass. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and glanced at her, then looked at the man's hand on her arm. It was a signal, a silent cue. She knew what she had to do. Gathering all her courage, she turned slightly, catching the man off guard, and bit his hand. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to escape. She stumbled forward, getting out of his reach. The police burst through the door, quickly advancing with their weapons drawn. He hesitated, his face contorted with anger, but he knew he was outnumbered. The officers moved in, bringing him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. He thrashed, his eyes filled with rage as they restrained him. One of the officers approached her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They said he was a dangerous man, wanted for multiple assaults and murders in the city. She blinked, the reality of his words sinking in. A murderer? The thought sent chills down her spine, and she felt the weight of the encounter heavier than ever. She nodded, grateful that he had finally been apprehended. The man hadn't just been lurking around the police station. He had been hiding, waiting, blending into the shadows, ready to strike. The police finished their reports, and she was left alone in the quiet gas station. The shelves were disarrayed, items scattered after their struggle. The man was gone, but she couldn't shake off the horror of it all. The scars he left would remain with her, a reminder of the darkness lurking just beyond the light. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning, my usual routine. A quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple: get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, he struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, The image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late, every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound. A knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing. Just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
Here, help me.
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask, the wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move, and he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. The house is haunted. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in a large, beautiful house. But that house wasn't always ours. It used to be an old police station. At first, everything seemed perfect, but there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It all started when I couldn't sleep in one specific. As a baby, I cried endlessly until my parents decided to move me to another room, leaving that bedroom for my brother. Years passed, and by the time I turned 5, the nightmares began. They weren't ordinary nightmares, they were terrifying. There was always someone visiting me whenever I slept. Sometimes it was a woman in a white dress standing at the foot of my bed, other times a man in a police uniform. Their presence made it impossible for me to sleep peacefully. Especially that man, every night. He chased me in my dreams without knowing the reason. In my dream, I would run, but no matter how fast I ran, he would always be right behind me. I called for help, but couldn't. Night after night, I wandered through my nightmares, waking up screaming in terror. It all felt disturbingly real. Some nights, he would sit on my bed, his twisted smile inches from my face, staring at me without blinking. All I could do was silently cry and beg for mercy. Not only was I affected, but my parents were exhausted from the sleepless nights. My mother always tried to reassure me, but I could see him standing right behind her, watching and smirking. Of course, my mother couldn't see him. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I could still feel his presence somewhere in the house. It followed me everywhere, like a shadow always lurking behind me. A dark figure standing still, observing. I felt as though I was living in a haunted house. I could feel him behind me as I ran up the stairs, his breath on the back of my neck. I started running up and down the stairs, but I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always right there, just out of reach. When I was a teenager, I finally opened up to my mother, recounting every detail about the terrifying figure that had tormented me for years. Her face turned pale as I spoke. She told me something that made my skin crawl. Our house, once a police station, was haunted by the spirit of an officer who had been anything but friendly in life. When he died, his spirit returned to the building and refused to leave. As it turned out, his office was the very room I couldn't sleep in as a child. That room was now my brother's bedroom. My mother had also seen him and felt his presence, but it didn't stop there. My brother had seen him too, and what he told me sent chills down my spine. Last year, when my brother was 16, the man appeared to him as well, yelling at him to get out of his office. My brother, strangely calm, replied, "No, this is my room now. You're dead. You need to leave." Over time, the man's attitude softened, and they began to coexist, even talking to each other occasionally. I was shocked. My brother had been living with this terrifying presence for years, but had kept it all to himself. I asked him why he had never told anyone. He simply said he knew no one would believe him. Eventually, we moved out when my little sister was born. The new house was free of ghosts, and I was relieved to finally leave that nightmare behind after 8 long years. But what about my brother? For the first 2 years in our new house, the man still visited him. But he was different now, no longer frightening, just visiting, as if he had found some peace. My brother said he no longer sees him and believes the man has finally found rest. Hearing that, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The man had moved on. But to this day, my brother and I can still see ghosts, yet none has ever frightened me like that man from the police station. Mysterious hitchhiker. Ami didn't really like driving. A few years ago, she had to drive for hours every day to attend her specialized course. One day, on her usual route, the traffic was worse than she expected. She was tired and frustrated, inching her car forward bit by bit, feeling like time was dragging on endlessly. The cause of the traffic jam was a broken-down bus. Ami finally passed it and sighed with relief as the road ahead cleared up. But then, a few miles later, something caught Ami's attention. At a bus stop, there was a pregnant woman with her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. Ami thought she needed help. Without thinking much, Ami slowed down and stopped. The woman opened the door and got in. The woman gently thanked Ami, explaining that the bus had broken down and she'd be waiting forever if she relied on it. She said she needed a short ride, and Ami agreed. They chatted for a bit, with Ami politely responding, but something didn't feel right. The woman's voice was strange, making Ami feel uneasy. Ami drove for a while in awkward silence. Then suddenly, 2 police cars with blaring sirens sped past them. The woman next to Ami tensed up, acting strangely as if she were hiding something. That's when Ami noticed the woman gripping her purse tightly. Something shiny caught her eye. It looked like metal, maybe a knife. Every instinct told her that something was very wrong. She kept driving, trying to stay calm. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't let on that she had seen it. That's when she noticed something strange. The woman's hair looked unnatural. Ami glanced over and realized she was wearing a wig. Beneath it, she could see stubble and thick hair on the woman's face and arms. This wasn't a pregnant woman at all. This was someone of an entirely different gender. She was a man. This wasn't just a hitchhiker. This was a dangerous person who had clearly planned this. Ami slowed down and stopped the car by the side of the road, hoping to buy herself a little more time. He immediately asked her why she had stopped the car. She started lying to distract him. She said she was feeling unwell and needed to stop and step outside for a bit. Her hands began trembling as she gripped the door handle. As soon as she stepped out of the car, she left the engine running. Luckily, her car had an anti-theft system, the only thing stopping the car from being driven without her. He got into the driver's seat and tried to drive it away, but suddenly the engine stopped. He angrily got out, still in the guise of a woman. He began shouting, telling her to come back, but she pretended not to hear and kept walking. She heard his frantic footsteps behind her. Ami turned to see him rushing towards her, the wig falling off, revealing the truth as she had predicted. She could only run as fast as she could. The car approached and slowed down when they saw her. Ami waved frantically, begging them to stop. When they did, she pleaded for help, telling them someone was chasing her. The driver didn't say anything, but they saw the panic in her eyes and let her into the car. They drove back to where Amy's car was, but by the time they arrived, he had disappeared. Ami reported the incident to the police. Not long after, they found and arrested the hitchhiker, a dangerous fugitive, wanted for a string of crimes. She could have been his next victim if she hadn't been alert. The Yin and Yang train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. "Why am I here?" I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
He said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard something, a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back, glancing at Rena's bedroom. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. The phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. Pharmacy obsession. It was a quiet evening. Lily had been working as a pharmacy technician for a few years. It was a simple job. filling prescriptions and dispensing medications. The pharmacy had its regular customers. Some were friendly, while others were a bit odd, but everyone got used to them. Joe was one of those regulars, a man in his mid-30s who came by often. He stood out with his long, disheveled hair and eccentric clothing. Lily had seen Joe and his elderly mother many times. She was always his caretaker, bringing Joe in to get his medication. The mix of drugs he needed included antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and a type of medicine for infectious diseases. Joe always complimented Lily and called her Kitty because she wore a pink bow hair clip. It was harmless, though strange. Lily would politely smile, chat, and give him his medication. He never made her feel unsafe. One day, Joe's mother came alone. She looked tired, older than before. She told them that Joe wasn't well. He had stopped taking his antipsychotic medication and was becoming unpredictable, sometimes even aggressive. She could no longer control him. The court had declared Joe unfit to make decisions, so he was admitted to a mental health facility. Lily felt a bit sad, missing the familiar face, but relieved knowing Joe was being taken care of. For months, they didn't see Joe. The facility's staff regularly picked up his prescriptions, and life at the pharmacy went on as usual. Then, one Friday night, everything changed. It was late. Only she and another female colleague were working. The store was quiet, as it often was on Friday nights. Lily was reading a magazine at the counter. Then, she heard a voice.
Hey, Kitty.
At first, she didn't look up. After all, she wasn't Kitty, and she figured someone in the store was talking. But then the voice came again, angrier this time.
Kitty!
Suddenly, a bloodied hand slammed onto the counter in front of Lily, startling her. It was Joe, but something was wrong. He was bleeding heavily. The counter was smeared with Joe's bloody handprint. His face was pale, his eyes wild, like he had lost his mind. Her heart raced, and she slowly backed away from him. Lily's colleague, Jane, hurried over, concerned, asking what Joe was doing there since his medication had already been picked up on Tuesday. Joe didn't answer. He just kept staring at Lily, his voice soft but filled with dangerous intensity. He said he wanted to see Kitty and that he missed her. He started moving toward the waist-high door that separated the pharmacy counter from the rest of the store. Panic rose in Lily. Jane tried to calm him down, but Joe kept repeating the same demand, saying he wanted to see Kitty and telling Lily to come closer. She shook her head, fear rising inside her. She refused Joe, saying she couldn't come closer, but he didn't stop, beginning to cry and then scream. He started climbing over the counter, his bloody hands gripping the edge, leaving deep red stains on the white surface. Jane realized things were getting out of control and told Lily to hide in the storage room. Lily slammed the door shut and locked it, listening as Joe's voice turned into full-blown screams. He was throwing things all over the store in a frenzy, grabbing whatever he could reach. Blood spattered over bottles and shelves. Jane called the store manager and quickly phoned the police. Through the crack of the door, Lily could see the chaos. A few customers had gathered, staring in shock. One of them moved as if they were about to intervene. Both Lily and Jane shouted together,
"Don't touch him!"
because Joe had an infectious disease, and his blood was everywhere. Anyone who touched him would be at risk of infection. The police arrived quickly, but didn't rush in. They were wearing full protective gear, gloves, masks, and all because of Joe's blood. They cautiously approached him. At first, he resisted, screaming for Lily. But finally, the police managed to sneak behind him and sedate him. Joe collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and his bloody rampage was over. The store had to be closed. A specialized cleaning crew came to disinfect everything. A few days later, after the store reopened, Joe's mother came by to apologize. Joe was then transferred to a higher security facility where he would be more closely monitored. The smell of blood and the fear still lingered in Lily's memory. She hadn't seen Joe since that night. She heard that Joe's mother had considered suing the care facility for negligence, but she didn't follow up on what happened next. She just continued her work, but she would never forget him. The outcome of the Hitchhiker Man. I was working the third shift at a 24/7 diner in a quiet town. Most of our customers were truck drivers and travelers passing through. But the strangest people I've ever met were the drifters, addicts, and hitchhikers. That night started like any other. Carl, the cook, had been working at this place for over 15 years, and he had seen it all. His sharp eyes could spot trouble from a mile away. We were perfectly in sync. I served tables, and he flipped burgers. Oh, with a new cast in the pipeline, and he flipped burgers. Around 4 a.m., the shift was well underway. The place was completely silent, not a single person in sight. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of the old refrigerator. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A man stumbled in, clutching his right arm to his chest. He didn't say a word, just shuffled past Carl and me, heading straight to the bathroom. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was twisted in pain. Carl and I exchanged glances. We'd seen strange customers before, but there was something off about this guy, more than just a regular drifter. I asked Carl, "Doesn't he look familiar?" After a moment, I remembered. That guy had come in before, begging for food and a ride. We had to kick him out because he was bothering the customers. But now, something had changed. He looked panicked, like he had seen something terrifying. Carl just shook his head, muttering, "Here we go again." I looked at the bathroom door. I didn't want to check on him, but I didn't have much choice. Carl handed me the keys, nodding toward the bathroom. "Go check if he's all right." I knocked on the door, asking if he needed help, but there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time. Still, nothing. I called out, fumbling with the keys. I pushed the door open, saying I was coming in. The bathroom was empty. No trace of the man. No dirt, no blood, nothing. The bathroom was as clean as the night before. I froze at the doorway. "End and year and ye and Andra." I screamed for Carl. He rushed over. I backed away as he pushed past me, staring into the spotless room with wide, disbelieving eyes. We stood behind the counter, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could he have disappeared? I looked at Carl, but he had the same horrified expression as I did. Then I saw movement near the front window. The man was outside, staring at us. His face was worse than before, bloody, swollen, and his eyes were bleeding. But what froze me in place was how his right hand hung limply at his side, looking like it was about to snap off. His thumb was sticking straight up, unnaturally stiff, as if he was trying to hitch a ride. Before I could grab the phone to call 911, a loud noise echoed from the back of the diner. Carl and I rushed to the back. It was coming from the freezer. Someone was tearing into the food boxes. Carl grabbed a knife from the counter, and we slowly moved in. The man was inside, tearing open a box of frozen meatballs and pressing a pile of meat against his arm, like he was possessed. But his arm, it wasn't right. His hand was dangling, almost detached from his wrist. For a moment, everything went still. We locked eyes on him, witnessing something we couldn't believe. Then, at an unnatural speed, he bolted past us, kicked the kitchen door open, and ran outside. Carl and I stood there, too shocked to react. We had just witnessed the impossible. Carl hurried to the front, locked the diner doors, and turned off the lights, plunging the place into darkness. The only light now came from the neon sign outside, casting a dim red glow on the counter. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. That man, if he was really injured, was moving with an unnatural speed and strength. And those eyes. It was like something else was controlling him. When I looked out the window, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of the man. Carl stood with me, his face tense, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. I asked Carl what we should do now, and if we should call the police. Carl shook his head and said they wouldn't believe us, and there was no way to explain this. He reconsidered, slowly walking to the phone and picking up the receiver. But just as he dialed 911, the lights in the diner flickered. The hum of the refrigerator went silent, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, in the darkness, we heard a soft, slow tapping on the window. We bolted through the kitchen, with Carl leading the way. I glanced back just in time to see the glass shatter, and the man crawling through the window like a wild animal. Carl pushed open the back door, and we stumbled out into the alley behind the diner. Carl panted, glancing around. We need to get to the car. We sprinted down the alley, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. He was faster than I expected, his heavy breathing growing louder as he closed in on us. I could hear his raspy voice muttering something, words I couldn't quite make out. Carl reached the car, fumbling with the keys, urging me to get in quickly as the doors unlocked. I yanked the door open and jumped inside just as Carl started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the man standing at the end of the alley. Now he was covered in blood, his smile wider as he slowly raised his thumb again, rigid and grotesque, like a hitchhiker's signal. Tires screeched as Carl slammed on the gas, and the truck sped out of the alley and onto the road. I glanced into the rear-view mirror, my heart still racing. The man stood motionless at the edge of the diner, watching us disappear into the night. We didn't speak for the first few miles, both of us too stunned to process what had just happened. We drove in silence for the next hour, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I eventually called the police to report the incident. To my surprise, they told us to head toward a location near the diner. They confirmed that a man matching that description had been reported. A man had been killed in a hit and run accident near the ramp, not far from the diner. As I got closer, I saw it. It was the same man. His body lay by the roadside, his clothes covered in dirt. But the eeriest part was his right hand, still holding that thumb up, just like before. According to the report, the man had survived the initial accident earlier that night and had been able to walk. His desperate search for help led him to our diner before he collapsed on the road. But there was more to the story. It turned out that this man had been involved in a series of violent incidents years earlier, hitchhiking across states and attacking those who picked him up. The police pieced together his history, a fugitive, infamous for attacking victims and vanishing into the night. The accident had broken his body, but it didn't kill him immediately. He had stumbled into the diner, seeking refuge, only to return to the streets, where he was eventually found dead. The police said he had been trying to use his injury to manipulate others. We were lucky to have escaped him. As I stood in the parking lot, staring at the diner, everything started to make sense. The man wasn't a ghost. He was real. Maybe he had finally paid the price in the same way he had hurt others on the road. That was where his twisted journey had come to an end. Stalkers in the dark. I started working as a security guard, night shifting at a small shopping mall in the city right after graduating high school. This job was supposed to be simple. Sit in front of the screen, watch people come and go, and occasionally handle shoplifters or suspicious behavior. But the truth is, the nights can be long, even boring. Until Black Friday arrived in the month leading up to Halloween. I had heard stories about the chaos, people acting as if they were clawing to get the best deals. It was madness, pushing and shoving like a zombie apocalypse. This year, I was scheduled for the dreaded Black Friday shift. It was my second year, and I thought I knew what to expect. What I didn't expect was the note. When I arrived for my shift that evening, I found a note waiting for me on my desk, right in front of the row of CCTV monitors. It simply read, "If you're in the dark, stay indoors." It was puzzling, and I had no idea who it was meant for or what it referred to. I felt a bit uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank or something the cleaning crew accidentally left behind. I didn't want to dwell on it and focused on my job. As soon as the mall opened, chaos ensued. People pushed and shoved, scrambling for discounted items. Every walkie-talkie on the team was buzzing non-stop. We had 10 security guards on duty, and it still wasn't enough to manage the madness. Late in the evening, things calmed down a bit until I received a call over the radio. A group of men was reportedly mugging someone with a knife in the third-floor parking lot. I quickly decided to check the cameras to see what I was getting into. As I unlocked the door and swung it open, I nearly bumped into someone. There was a strange man sitting inside. He was standing in front of the screen, wearing a red and green Christmas outfit. His head turned toward the monitor, making me freeze. He slowly turned his face toward me, a pair of sunglasses covering his eyes, even though the room was pitch black. Before I could say a word, he stepped closer, his face just inches from mine, flashing a toothy grin, sharp teeth like a shark's. "Did you get my note?" I reached for the walkie-talkie, but before I could do anything, the lights in the room went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I raised my hands, bracing for him to lunge at me, but instead, I felt nothing. I shone the flashlight, and he had vanished, leaving the room empty with just me standing there. I tried to calm myself and refocus on my pressing duties. The dimly lit corridors of the mall were filled with strange decorations, shadows, and the faint echo of creepy sound effects coming from the nearby costume shop. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. A life-sized mannequin in the costume shop window. It was dressed in an outfit identical to that of the strange man. I turned to look behind me as I heard a noise coming from behind, glancing through the shop's glass. The mannequin was no longer inside. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a raspy laugh behind me. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there he was, the man, grinning horrifically and then lunging toward me. I stumbled back, narrowly dodging him. I weaved between the aisles and ran up the escalator, my heart pounding as I tried to put as much distance as possible between us. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the security room and slammed the door shut, locking it tight behind me. I quickly accessed the camera feeds, searching for any sign of the man. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the screens, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Then, on one of the feeds, I saw him standing in the hallway just outside the security room, staring directly into the camera. A sinister smile plastered across his face, waving at me. I grabbed the walkie again, calling for backup, but the signal was distorted. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I hurriedly fumbled for my flashlight. A creaking sound like claws scraping the door echoed. I braced myself, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, as the door swung open and he stepped inside, laughing mockingly at my fear. I remembered the emergency lever behind the desk. Without hesitation, I rushed over, pulling it down just as he reached for me. He lunged at me, and we got caught in a struggle. He was stronger than he looked, his hands clawing at me as I tried to push him away. We slammed into the metal shelves, the impact echoing throughout the room. I pulled the walkie from my belt, calling for backup again. My voice trembled with tension, but I just hoped someone would hear me. After a tense struggle, I pushed him away one last time, and he staggered. This time, I seized the opportunity, quickly grabbing a metal rod nearby and locking it against the door, trapping him inside. I quickly called for assistance. I stood guard at the door, listening to his screams from the other side. Within minutes, 2 officers ran down the hallway, guns drawn. They reached me, and I unlocked the door, stepping back as they stormed in. I watched as they put him into the police car, his eyes still fixed on me until the very last moment. Back in the security room, I sat down, exhausted but relieved. I scrolled through the camera feeds, carefully checking each one. Then on the feed from the costume shop, I noticed something odd. A new mannequin, dressed in the same outfit, stood in the display window. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen. It was just a mannequin, right? As I looked, a shadow moved behind it, just a flicker, barely visible. My hand hovered over the controls, but I shook my head to clear my thoughts. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks after a long night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for me out there to confront it. Escape from the terrifying truck. On a Sunday afternoon, Mac and I decided to go hiking in some hills, just an hour's drive from the city. The hill we chose today had a fairly simple trail, not too steep, and when we reached the top, everything felt peaceful, just like any other time we had gone hiking. After a short rest, we started heading down, but just 10 minutes later, Mac began complaining about the rough path. He wanted to take a different trail down. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We hadn't seen another soul since we started our descent. Then we heard the sound of an engine. A rusty, heavy red truck was coming toward us. The man driving rolled down his window and flashed a smile that seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. He offered us a ride. Mac, always trusting, thought the guy seemed nice enough. I wasn't so sure. Mac begged and convinced me to get in, saying it was only a 10-minute drive. I was cautious, but I got in with him. Inside, the truck was shabby but clean. As we settled in, I instinctively started scanning my surroundings. My eyes were drawn to the floor, where I saw a coil of rope behind the driver's seat. Unease began to creep in. 10 minutes passed. We were no closer to the main road, and the woods around us grew denser. I asked the man how much longer it would take. He said we were just taking a different route and that we'd have to stop somewhere to pick up his stuff. We stopped in front of a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. There was an old tree stump out front, with a large axe stuck in it as if he had been chopping wood. I glanced at Mac, but he seemed excited and trusting of the man. The man turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He said,
Stay here. I'll be right back.
As soon as he was out of sight, panic started to rise within me. I turned to Mac, pleading with him to leave, not to get out, but he didn't see the danger I saw. That's when I turned back to the truck and saw it. Half hidden under the driver's seat was an axe. Dark stains covered the blade stains that could only be blood. I quickly told Mac to look. He froze, his face turning pale as he realized the danger we were in. Without another word, we bolted into the forest, fleeing the imminent threat. We crashed through the thick underbrush, not caring where we were headed as long as it was away from that cabin, trying to stay on a trail to avoid getting lost. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the wooden fence surrounding the parking lot. A wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw it. The man's truck was parked on the other side of the lot, engine off, lying in wait like a predator ready to pounce. Mac wanted to run to our car, but I held him back. The parking lot was too wide, too exposed for us to make a safe escape. We hid behind a large tree, cloaked in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As night fell, I heard a sound. The truck's door creaked open. The man climbed out, glancing around the forest once more. Mac made a mistake. He stepped on a branch, causing a snap. The man noticed and lingered for a moment, then started walking toward a nearby tree. We covered our mouths, hearts pounding, afraid to breathe or move as he came dangerously close to where we were hiding. Just then, a forest ranger approached the truck. The man seemed startled or afraid of being caught, so he quickly returned to his truck and drove away. As soon as he was gone, we bolted to our car, not stopping until we were inside with the doors locked. We sped out of there as fast as we could. That night, we drove in silence. The danger was behind us, but the fear lingered. As we finally returned to safety, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if we had stayed in that truck any longer. When we got back, we reported the incident to the forest rangers so they could investigate and warn other hikers to be more cautious.